Meeting of the Senate Judiciary Committee will come to order. We have 9 nominees listed on the agenda for the first time today. They'll be held over and receive a vote next week. They are Dana Douglas for the 5th Circuit, Brad Garcia for the D.C. Circuit, Francis Beam for the Eastern District of Michigan, Jerry Blackwell for the District of Minnesota, and Ann Nardacci for the Northern District of New York. We have 2 nominees to the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. I'm told that is now known as PCLOB, and 2 U.S. Marshal nominees who will receive a vote today. Finally, we have 2 bipartisan bills on the agenda. The Speak Out Act, sponsored by Senators Gillibrand and Blackburn and co-sponsored by Senators Hirono, Graham, Blumenthal, Portman, and myself, is going to be held over for another week to allow bipartisan negotiations to continue. We will consider the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, sponsored by Senators Klobuchar and Kennedy, and co-sponsored by 12 other senators, including from this committee, Booker, Whitehouse, Graham, Feinstein, Hirono, Blumenthal, and myself. Before I turn to Ranking Member Grassley, let me briefly address the continued violence and threats of violence that members of federal law enforcement and the judiciary have faced since the FBI executed a judicially issued search warrant at former President Trump's residence on August the 8th. Following the search, the former president and his allies have relentlessly criticized the FBI with baseless claims and violent rhetoric. Some members of Congress have been called on to, quote, defund the FBI, destroy the FBI. Others have referred to the FBI as the Gestapo. The former president called FBI officials, quote, vicious monsters, close quote. It's time for these attacks to stop. We've been reminded over and over again of the vulnerability of those who are in service to this nation and to this Congress, of violent threats and violent conduct. We have tried uniformly to condemn them on a bipartisan basis and should continue to. The FBI and the Department of Homeland Security have warned of an increase in violent threats and acts of violence against federal law enforcement officials and facilities following the FBI's August 8th search. These include threats to place a dirty bomb outside the FBI headquarters and online calls for civil war and armed rebellion. On August the 11th, a man wearing body armor and armed with an AR-15 assault rifle and a nail gun attempted to breach the FBI's Cincinnati field office. On August 16th, the man was indicted for threatening to murder everyone at the FBI, from Director Wray to agents, even custodial staff. FBI is not alone in receiving these vile threats. The magistrate judge who approved the search warrant has been subjected to a torrent of violent and anti-Semitic threats. A synagogue on whose board the judge serves canceled services because of these threats. As I've said many times, political violence and threats of violence in furtherance of any cause is unacceptable. I commend to you to read the horrifying article in the Washington Post this morning about one of our colleagues in the House and what she has been put through with threats at her home. We must condemn the growing use of violence for political grievance and not fan the flames of hate ourselves. I renew my call for the Senate to pass the Daniel Anderl Judicial Security and Privacy Act, a bill that would protect our federal judges and that has been held up by one Republican senator on the floor for months. We passed this bill at a committee in December. We need to get it passed on the floor. With that, let me turn to Senator Grassley, and after that, we'll vote on the PCLOB and Marshall nominees before turning to the legislation of the moment. Senator Grassley.
I think I should start with saying I agree with you. It's pretty inconsistent for any person to abhor the defunding of local police and suggest defunding the FBI. We've got to make sure that the FBI is doing what FBI should do, and that takes resources. Another thing I think that I have pointed out during August on this whole issue is that everybody maybe thinks about from top to bottom that there's problems in the FBI. I never hear from Iowans about the dozens of FBI agents that we have working the grassroots of the Midwest, that there's any problems there. But I think there really are problems at Central FBI that we have to work on. And we should have extraordinary confidence in the FBI. And I think they've lost a lot of their credibility and this isn't just the recent incident that you referred to, Mr. Chairman. This is over the last maybe good part of a decade anyway, some things that have gone on, mostly related to the two words political bias. In regard to today's meeting, we've requested that the judicial nominees on the markup for the first time be held over. We can vote on 2 U.S. Marshal nominees on the agenda. I want to refer to one of the nominees that I've had close working relationship with, Rich DeZino, who served as my chief counsel for national security and crime. I'm happy to see that his nomination to the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board is receiving a vote today. Having served in the Justice Department, he knows that the government has a duty to its citizens. The government has a responsibility to protect fellow Americans. He also understands the need to protect civil liberties and privacy. I'm also confident that Rich understands how to work in a bipartisan and nonpartisan way. He did it repeatedly while working on this committee, and I think it's important that he'll bring that ability to the board. I want to say a few words on some of the bipartisan bills that I've worked their way through this committee and through the Senate. First, this committee has discharged the Eagles Act and is currently on the hotline to pass the Senate. I've worked with the parents of victims from the Parkland, Florida, with the attorneys general of 40 states, with 10 Senate co-sponsors from both sides of the aisle, and with a bipartisan team, including Representative Deutsch and Diaz Barrett in the House to move this bill forward. The bill will give the Secret Service the resources they need to help organizations who voluntarily request training on the signs of when a person is mobilizing towards violent or interdict them, and particularly if they require mental health care. It's long past time that the community organizations, particularly our school districts that want this training, finally are able to get it so that future tragedies can be prevented. I hope this bill will pass the Senate soon. Second, with Senators Feinstein and Schatz, I've led a bill to expand cannabis research. This bill has passed the Senate and now the House with a few revisions, and I look forward to it passing the Senate again and becoming law. The Senate passed 2 House bills during Police Week before the beginning of the last recess. One was the House companion of a bill that I co-sponsored with Senator Ossoff, giving resources to police to deal with victims of traumatic brain injury, but the House has not moved on the 4 pro-police bills sent over by the Senate after being voted out of this committee. That includes a bill that I led with Senator Coons to help police combat PTSD, and one that I led with Senator Cortez Masto to fund small police departments, as well as another 2 led by Senators Cornyn and Whitehouse. We've all read the news reports that some House members don't want to see these pro-police bills move forward. I hope that these reports are wrong and that the House will soon do us the same courtesy as we did them with their bills and pass our Police Week bills. Lastly, I sent a letter to Attorney General Garland about his memo about members of the Department of Justice almost saying don't correspond or don't communicate with Congress. The timing of that memo is quite suspect. It came on the heels of the whistleblowers approaching Congress. You read about my participation with those whistleblowers and getting some changes made, or at least making public some changes. One person retired or fired as a result of it. But this memo failed to mention that we have 2 whistleblower protection statutes that his memo would be either having a chilling effect on whistleblowers doing what they should, or maybe stopping it entirely. Memos like this can chill whistleblowers, and that ought to be considered unacceptable by everybody in this committee. Whistleblowers are patriots. They expose government wrongdoing that we wouldn't otherwise know anything about. And I think I proved that we got some very favorable information from whistleblowers that were at least able to make some small changes in some of the things that the FBI does that's wrong. I yield.
Thanks, Senator Grassley. We have 2 nominees to Peak Club, and I understand we can take an en bloc voice vote on those nominees. Richard DeZino, Travis LeBlanc have been nominated to be members of the board. Mr. LeBlanc is a current board member, confirmed unanimously to that role last Congress. Mr. DeZino, I hope I pronounced that correctly, is former staffer to ranking members Grassley and Graham. Both of these nominees have strong credentials in national security and privacy. It's a bipartisan board, 5 members, 3 from the President's party, 2 from the minority party. These 2 nominees reflect both the bipartisan structure and our bipartisan commitment to ensure that we protect the nation's security and still remain vigilant when it comes to America's civil liberties. Before proceeding to a vote, does anyone wish to speak as to these nominees? If not, on favorably reporting the nominations of Richard DeZino and Travis LeBlanc to be members of the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
Mr. Chairman, I ask to be recorded as a no on LeBlanc.
Yeah, and I would also have these additional senators in addition to Blackburn: Lee, Sass, Kennedy, Hawley, and Cruz.
Without objection, all of those senators will be recorded as no. Despite those no votes, the majority members present voted in the affirmative, and the ayes have it. The nominations will be favorably reported to the floor. Let me see. I understand we can take an en bloc voice vote on 2 U.S. Marshal nominees, Brian Keyes and Stephen Lynn. Does anyone wish to speak on these nominees to be U.S. Marshal? If not, on favorably reporting the nominations of Brian Keyes and Stephen Lynn to U.S. Marshal positions, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
Mr. Chairman, I ask to be recorded as a no on Keyes.
Senator Blackburn will be recorded as no on Marshal nominee Brian Keyes.
I would like that as well, Mr.
Senator
Chairman.
Kennedy as well.
Oh, I was wrong on that last one.
No, this is for
Oh, then we have these on Keyes: Lee, Cruz, Hawley, and Blackburn.
Lee, Cruz, Hawley, Blackburn, and Kennedy. Did I get everyone?
Hawley? And Hawley would be on Lynn as well.
Hawley as well. Clear? Got 'em? Okay, I think we have all the names communicated to the clerk. Still a majority of members present having voted in the affirmative. The ayes have it. Nominations be favorably reported to the floor. We're now turned to S673, Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, JCPA. It's sponsored by 2 committee members, Klobuchar and Kennedy, co-sponsored by other committee members, Booker, Whitehouse, Feinstein, Graham, Hirono, Blumenthal, and myself. The bipartisan bill will allow news organizations to band together to negotiate with the biggest online platforms over access to news content, with the backstop of a final offer arbitration to ensure those news organizations receive reasonable compensation for the work they do. Across the country, local newspapers and broadcasters play a critical role in informing the public. Yet we've seen a massive decline in local news coverage over the past few decades. Since 2005, the U.S. has lost approximately 2,500 newspapers. That's over a fourth of the newspapers that were in existence at that time. In my home state of Illinois, it's worse. 200 newspapers, nearly 35% of those in circulation, have closed during the same period of time. While big tech cannot be blamed entirely for this downward spiral, it is undeniable that large online gatekeepers like Google and Facebook are siphoning away more and more of the advertising revenues that news organizations have relied on to do their work. It's estimated that Google and Facebook keep as much as 70 cents of each ad dollar spent on their networks. And with nearly 9 out of 10 Americans reporting they get their news online, only the largest news organizations have sufficient leverage to demand a fair share of the pie. That's where JCPA comes in. This bill allows news publishers with fewer than 1,500 employees and non-network news broadcasters to join together and enter into a structured negotiation with the biggest online platforms. Importantly, the bill contains measures designed to ensure the proceeds of these negotiations go where they're needed the most, employing journalists. In the lead up to today's vote, I received a letter from a friend of mine of many years, Dennis Lyle, president of the Illinois Broadcasters Association. I'd like to share with you his summary of the issue before us. The JCPA will frankly level the playing field so broadcasters can jointly negotiate with dominant online platforms and be fairly compensated for their valuable local content, not to mention also prevent big tech from siphoning off huge amounts of advertising revenue that are the lifeblood of free local journalism, so broadcasters can keep journalists on their payrolls. I couldn't have said it better myself. That's why I'm proud to support this legislation, and now I'll turn first to Senator Klobuchar, then to Senator Kennedy. Senator Grassley?
Yeah,
first to Senator Grassley.
I just want everybody to know that I'm going to support this bill because of the, I guess I could associate myself with your remarks in regard to my support for it. I may vote for some of the amendments, but I'm going to vote for the bill regardless of how the amendment process goes.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. I'll recognize Senator Klobuchar first, then Senator Kennedy. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Chair Durbin, and thank you and Senator Grassley for your support for this bill. I want to thank Senator Kennedy. We've worked on this bill for months and months and months and have been able to make some changes that he's requested. And we're very excited about the bipartisan group of co-sponsors. You've mentioned the ones on the committee, Senator Durbin, but we also have Senator Thune as a co-sponsor of the bill, as well as Senator Lummis, Collins, and Cassidy, as well as many others on the Democratic side that are interested in supporting the bill. So I look at this issue as a First Amendment issue. I'm the daughter of a newspaperman, you all know that, and it is really important that we maintain our news organizations. And I was thinking about this when I woke up this morning and read the tragic story of a Las Vegas investigative reporter named Jeff Gehrman, who was stabbed to death. The #1 suspect is a politician that he was covering, doing investigative reporting, who just lost his primary in the Democratic primary, and he's now in custody. And it just gives you a jarring example of the kind of work that goes on at the local level, that it isn't all a federal game. It isn't all big news organizations that are looking into what's going on in everything from city councils to state legislatures to what the crop reports are, to what the flood is that's coming in, to even covering the high school football game. And we don't want to lose that, not only because it's important to look at what's going on in our local communities, but also because we don't want to lose that fabric that we get at the local level. The coverage matters, and it strengthens our democracy, not only by bringing people together, but also the accountability that's part of it. This kind of local reporting is at risk because the market is being distorted in a way that undermines the ability of local news to receive some of the profit. As you point out, well, Senator Durbin, it's not the only issue, but in receiving some of the profit generated by the content that they are producing. As a result, as noted, local news is facing a crisis in the U.S. Since 2005, 2,200 local newspapers across America have closed. Local news outlets aren't closing or reducing their coverage because of a lack of talent or passion for their work. It's a lack of revenue. Ad revenue for U.S. newspapers plummeted from over $37 billion in 2008 to less than $9 billion in 2020. A recent study by Northwestern University predicted that 1/3 of U.S. newspapers that existed roughly 2 decades ago will be gone by 2025. At the same time, Google and Meta, aka Facebook, became digital advertising titans, raking in billions in ad dollars while taking news content, feeding it to their users, and not offering fair compensation to the news organizations and the reporters that actually do the reporting. Google recently reported $61 billion in advertising revenue in a single 3-month period, a 33% jump from the same period the prior year, which is the fourth quarter of 2021. Their dominance over the news means less money for local news outlets and fewer journalists to do the in-depth local reporting. Last February on our subcommittee, we had a hearing on this issue and heard from small newspapers and radio stations who testified about the challenges that their outlets are facing. They testified that they can't even get the platforms to come to the table to negotiate on price, and that they have been told that they will be punished if they use any other advertising tool. That is why Senator Kennedy and I, who believe in negotiation and competition and fair markets, introduced the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act. The bill will help, as noted by Senator Durbin and Grassley, it will help level the playing field and give local news outlets the ability to band together to negotiate for fair compensation with mega titan companies, biggest companies the world has ever known, like Google and Facebook, so that they can continue to invest in the kind of quality reporting that keeps us all informed. As you all know, this is not just a problem in the U.S., but other countries as well. At least one country, Australia, took similar steps, different structure, different laws, to bring Google and Facebook to the negotiating table. It is working. I will note that Google and Facebook did not go under in the land down under. The internet did not break. They are still making money, big money. At the same time, news organizations are getting a fair share of ad revenue. This is why our bill sets up a framework for joint negotiations between news outlets and the digital platforms. It provides a narrow safe harbor under the law for newspapers or news broadcasters to work together to negotiate for compensation for their original content. The bill includes an obligation enforceable in court for the platforms to negotiate in good faith and make reasonable offers. And for news publisher, the bill includes the right to invoke binding final offer arbitration if the negotiations fail to produce an agreement after 180 days. The bill is focused on news publishers that serve a primarily U.S. audience, employ journalists, update their content at least weekly. It's also focused on small and medium news organizations. It excludes news organizations owned by foreign governments and publications with more than 1,500 full-time employees, which would include the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. They are excluded, as well as the major national television networks. This framework will help to ensure that small and local news publishers and broadcasters will be treated fairly in the marketplace, which in turn will help sustain the work of local journalists. That is why it has the support of thousands of local papers from around the country, the News Media Alliance, the National Association of Broadcasters, National Newspaper Association, and the Authors Guild, a national nonprofit association of more than 12,000 professional writers, including over 3,000 journalists. We have to take action to allow these news organizations to get fair compensation. I wish it wasn't like this. I wish that we could have done something about the monopoly situation that we're in. But this is what we're in right now, and we must respond. I'll end by saying last week, Senator Portman and I traveled to Ukraine. We met with President Zelensky for over an hour, and I thought about, as he did as well, how the people of their country are putting their very lives on the line for democracy. And what we're trying to do here, in the best way that we could find possible on a bipartisan basis, was to salvage a part of our democracy, which is the First Amendment, to make sure that we continue to have local news reporting in all of our communities. With that, I hope that Senator Kennedy could say a few words.
I'm going to take a point of personal privilege to acknowledge the return of the legendary, undaunted senior senator from the state of Vermont, former chairman of the committee. Welcome back, Pat Leahy.
Thank you. I can't tell you how good it feels to be back.
Glad to have you. Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome back, Senator Leahy. You look well. We're glad to have you back. I want to make a couple of points, and I have some amendments at the appropriate time, Mr. Chairman. The first point I'll make is a point that I have made previously. We did have a hearing on this bill on a subcommittee. But as I have said before, I think we've missed an opportunity by not having a hearing before the full committee. So everybody will have an opportunity to have their say, and more importantly, to gather more information. I think we could have learned something. That's point one. Point two, there will be a number of amendments today that I hope will strengthen the bill. I have two. One would protect the social media against frivolous litigation by requiring the losing party to pay attorney's fees. The other one would reduce the sunset provision on this bill from 8 years to 6, shortening the time that our publishers would be immune from antitrust scrutiny. This bill, of course, is intended to help small newspapers and broadcasters. I do not intend, and I only speak for myself, I do not intend it to be an anti-social media bill. Most of our social media companies are American companies, and I'm very proud of that. That they have enjoyed extraordinary success. And in many respects, not all, as I'll talk about in a moment, but in many respects, that they have improved our quality of life, I think. I think social media, well, first, just the internet in general, I'm always constantly amazed at the fact that almost the entire body of human knowledge is available with a click on a computer. I think that's improved our world immensely. In terms of social media, I think it has made, in many respects, it's made people less lonely. That's a good thing. Social media can deliver insight. Social media can deliver joy. Social media can give voice to the timid, and I think that's important. With one click now, one can become an activist on social media. In many respects, the social media has made our world smaller, and I think that is a good thing. I think it's a good thing when we talk to each other. There have been downsides. Number one, I think there's an enormous amount of confusion about the censorship by social media. And we all have our opinions on that. I don't think it's fair. I think many of the people who run social media are left of center as opposed to right of center, and I think they censor content by those who are right of center more than they do left of center. I know some will disagree with that, but that's what I believe. It bothers me, government interference with the content on social media bothers me. There have been recent allegations that the Biden White House has tried to influence content on social media. I don't think that's a good thing. I don't think any White House should use its power, if that's true, to censor content on social media. And we need to have a standard to try to we can all agree that poison is being spread on social media. The problem, of course, is what is poison. And I don't think government ought to make that decide that definition. That's point one. Point two, this also bothers me about social media. I think it has made our society coarser. I think social media has lowered the cost of being an a-hole. And I really regret that. I mean, people say things on social media that they would never say to another person in person. I don't know what to do about that, but I don't think it's made our society better. So in addition to, in some respects, being a killing field for the truth, social media has also, in many respects, made our people coarser. The final point, I think social media, I'm not against big, I'm against dumb. And our social media companies are so successful that they're no longer companies, they're corporations. And they have, as is their right in a competitive free market, they have sucked up most of the advertising like a Hoover Deluxe. Now that's fine in a competitive free market. But they have done that by, in my opinion, unfairly using the creative content of others. And that has really hurt a lot of the small newspapers and a lot of the small broadcasters in my state. And I think that for a small amount of time, a limited period of time, this bill will help those broadcasters and small newspapers compete. I also think that circumstance, and this will be my final point, that circumstance that I've just described, large social media organizations using the content of small newspapers to generate advertising revenue and to take that advertising revenue away from small newspapers and broadcasters. I think that his circumstance has also changed journalism. I do. This is not true of all of our broadcasters and newspapers. I don't think it's even true of, I hope, most of them. But some of these smaller and indeed larger news media organizations have now entered a post-journalism world. They become agenda journalists. I'm sure there are a multitude of reasons for that, but I think one of the reasons, maybe not the major, maybe it is they're trying to survive. When I entered government, newspapers and broadcasters made most of their money from advertising, not from subscriptions, and they could tell the American people what they needed to hear, not what they wanted to hear. Now that world has changed. Those media organizations have to make their money from subscribers, and there is way too much pander for pay, and I think it has hurt journalism. And I'm hoping that over time, this bill will help our media organizations, both newspapers and broadcasters, to be able to return to a model where they just report who, what, when, where, and why, and don't have to add their opinion. And for all those reasons, Mr. Chairman, I am going to support this bill, and at the appropriate time, I will offer my amendments.
Thanks, Senator Kennedy.
Chairman,
Just one moment, please. If some people would turn off their microphones for just a moment, we have too many microphones on.
Maybe it's mine.
All right. I just want to make one comment before I recognize another senator. Senator Kennedy raised a point about the procedure of the committee, which I'd like to clarify, and I'd hoped was general understanding. What I've tried to do on our side is to empower the subcommittee chairs to lead with the hearings and not to swoop in at full committee and take that away from them, but also at the same time to encourage them to open their subcommittee hearings to those who are not stated members of the subcommittees, and make sure that other members of Judiciary would be welcome to participate. So I'd hope to reach the balance there. I never made any formal announcement of that, but I think that is a policy most subcommittee chairs follow. I hope they do. Senator Feinstein?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to read a couple of paragraphs in a letter from the Los Angeles Times and the San Diego Union Tribune. From its inception, the United States has led the world in policies that support a liberal democracy and a free press. Without this type of legislation, we will fall behind many other democracies around the world. Australia, Canada, and France have enacted or are considering similar legislation to address this very issue. Google and Facebook have gained billions of dollars in advertising revenue by featuring news content that they did not pay to create. A significant portion has come directly at our expense, forcing us to move away from the ad-supported business, which has operated successfully for more than a century. While they are legally obligated to compensate book and music publishers and film and TV studios, no such mechanism exists for paying news publishers. With 673, we are asking for a temporary safe harbor from antitrust laws so that we can collectively negotiate terms on which dominant online platforms may distribute our online content. And just one more brief paragraph. In the last decade, California has lost nearly 150 newspapers, more than any other state in the country. Decimation of news sources does not discriminate, and it's widely distributed throughout the state. When local newspapers fold, civic engagement goes down, corruption goes up, and the ability to combat disinformation erodes further. It's damaging to these communities and to democracy. And then it goes on about the pluses. I think this is a clear statement of what the situation is that brings on the necessity from that bill. I accept it, and I intend to vote for the bill.
Now, we have a manager's amendment to be offered, and a number of people who wish to speak. Do you want to offer that amendment?
Yes, I want to offer the amendment 22A45.
Is there any objection to the manager's amendment 22A45? Without objection, the manager's amendment will be adopted. Senator Lee, and then Senator Leahy, and then a number of other senators. I'll announce them as we proceed. Senator Lee.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to thank Senators Klobuchar and Kennedy for their astute observations and for their efforts in this area, taking on something of a daunting challenge, addressing big tech, and especially addressing some of big tech's more pernicious influences on so many markets and so many industries. Healthy news industry is, of course, really important in a system of government like ours. In order for the people to have access to their ability to self-govern, they have to have access to the facts. And so you need an effective means by which information about government can be communicated so that people can make appropriate decisions with regard to the government, decisions that will affect them. This is important for all news outlets to be able to communicate that information accurately and effectively and efficiently. This is especially true for local news. Today, it's becoming clear that local journalism is struggling and that some of our major tech platforms at least share some of the blame in that. One of the areas where this is abundantly clear is in digital advertising. Google and Facebook have something of a stranglehold on the primary revenue source for online publications. And that's why earlier this year I introduced the Competition and Transparency in Digital Advertising Act to fix that very problem. And I'm pleased to have a bipartisan group of senators with me on that, including Senators Klobuchar, Cruz, Blumenthal, Hawley, Daines, and Rubio as co-sponsors. This bill that we're here to discuss today, the Journalism and Competition and Preservation Act, has the stated purpose, stated laudable purpose of improving competition and helping local journalism. Unfortunately, I believe that if this bill were to become law, it wouldn't do that. To the contrary, the JCPA has great potential to be disastrous for competition in the news industry itself, and great potential also to crush local news under the thumbs of big tech and big media. This new version of the JCPA, it's a new version that though entirely rewritten from its prior version, still shares at least three underlying flaws with the original version. First, this version of the JCPA would inextricably link the financial incentives of big tech and the news industry by requiring tech platforms to share their monopoly rents with news publishers, making publishers more dependent on big tech, not less. Allowing publishers to share in big tech's monopoly rents would give them, I fear, the incentive to cover up and defend big tech, rather than hold big tech accountable. Second, the JCPA would skew and distort the news coverage of politicians. This bill is a government handout to the news industry. The press will still be incentivized to attack those who oppose it and give a pass to those who support it. And I'm confident that I'm not the only person in this room who's concerned about further politicizing journalism. Sadly, the damage may have already been done simply by introducing this legislation. Third, the JCPA is fundamentally flawed in that it seeks to improve competition by sanctioning the formation of cartels, because that is what it does. That is its purpose. That's how this thing operates. It is allowing and sanctioning the formation of cartels in this area. So let's be clear about what we're doing, what we're considering. And we've already seen the evidence that Google and Facebook colluded to monopolize the digital advertising markets. We've seen that in great abundance. Do we really think that forcing one cartel to negotiate a backroom deal with another cartel is going to make things better? You know who won't be represented in the room? You know, consumers, readers, voters. Who's going to represent their interests if we don't protect the free market that allows them to have a voice, that allows them to impact the way this industry works, as it's supposed to in any industry? Now, I'd like now to discuss some of the new problems that this entirely new, rewritten version of the JCPA introduces that weren't in the original version. For example, the bill attempts but fails to prevent discrimination. When publisher cartels can't exclude members based on their size or their views, there are multiple proxies one can imagine. Discrimination by audience type or geographic market could be used to exclude certain areas of the country. Now, what if a cartel wanted to exclude publishers that serve rural areas or those whose audience is predominantly lower income? There's a recent article that put it this way. These self-appointed mainstream and left-wing media cartels are allowed to exclude. based on the usual totally subjective factors they always do, such as trustworthiness, fake news, extremism, misinformation, hate speech, conspiracy, correction policy, expertise, authoritativeness, etc. To my fellow conservatives, do we think that forcing big tech and big media to get into a room together to collude and agree on the terms under which news can appear on tech platforms, do we think that's going to result in anything good for our voices? Do we think that's going to ameliorate or eliminate censorship? The JCPA is meant to help small local publishers. But importantly here, the text of the bill makes clear that it will actually crush them. First, just look at the definition of the term eligible publisher and qualifying publication. While it's limited to publications with no more than 1,500 employees, it still includes conglomerates that own multiple publications. So a single newspaper with 1,501 employees, for example, is out, unless, of course, they can do some more layoffs and take advantage of the government handout as a result. While the national conglomerate that owns scores of 1,000 employee publications would be covered by this, would be allowed to collude and enter into a cartel. So why does this matter? Well, Section 4D5E2 of the bill requires that any final arbitration decision under the bill would have to direct 65% of the money collected from the platform to be distributed to cartel members based specifically on the number of employees they have. In other words, the bigger you are, the greater the share of the monopoly rents that you get. And this is not just a small sliver of it that's determined on the basis of how many employees the publication has. This is 65%, the vast supermajority of the revenue collected under this. So the bigger you are, the more monopoly rents you get. A small local publisher that puts a real effort, real sweat, blood, and tears, shoe leather into quality reporting that gets traction and clicks on a platform generating revenue for the cartel won't actually get the lion's share of the money that it earned. Instead, it'll be handed out to the larger cartel members based on the number of employees they have. And this doesn't help small publishers. Quite to the contrary, it further entrenches the much larger incumbents. And recall that Section 6A of the bill, as currently written, expressly prohibits preventing a publisher from joining the cartel based on the publisher's size. There's nothing the little guys can do to stop the big guys from coming in and eating their lunch. 65% of their lunch, to be precise. So when you boil it all down, the JCPA is just a way to transfer wealth from a politically disfavored group to a politically favored one, under the guise of supposedly improving competition. But it doesn't actually improve competition. Instead, it imposes massive transaction costs in the form of lawyer fees, expert fees, and arbitration costs. Now, setting aside the failures in concept and in execution, the JCPA is arguably unconstitutional. The bill countenances no world in which a publisher can refuse to distribute the content of a publisher. In fact, doing so is forbidden by the anti-retaliation clause. This seems to me to be something likely to amount to a violation of the First Amendment, because it's compelled speech. There are few areas of First Amendment jurisprudence that are clearer than in the area of compelled speech. One of the things that we hold sacred in this country is that the government, in addition to telling you you can't say something, it's also very, very prohibited for the government to tell you you must say something. So how ironic that a bill meant to protect the only industry named in the First Amendment would do so by violating the right to free speech. Now, it also forces the platforms to pay for publishers' content, whether they want it or not. And so in that respect, it amounts to a sort of Obamacare for the press. But regardless of that, the policy problems, the constitutional problems, the conceptual problems in this bill can't be saved by the good intentions, intentions which I greatly admire and efforts which I appreciate, to hold big tech accountable. Many of the same arguments that I've raised have been outlined in an outstanding letter submitted to the committee by Professor Daniel Francis of NYU Law School, and I'm going to submit that to the record, Mr. Chairman. But I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill. While it's a laudable aim, that is protecting local journalism from the predation of big tech, its pursuit of that goal is irreparably flawed, and it risks causing immense harm both to journalism and to competition. It'd be better called the Journalism Cartel and Protectionism Act. This legislation, written in the shadows by trade groups and a small handful of special interests, is simply not ready for prime time. The committee should send it back to the drawing board for reconsideration through a more open and transparent process. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Lee. We have a number of senators who've sought recognition. I don't know if that's just a statement, to make a statement, or to offer an amendment, but we want to make sure we give people an opportunity to speak to this important bill. I have listed Senator Leahy, Senator Hawley, Senator Padilla, Senator Blackburn. Anyone else? Senator Cornyn? Cruz? Blumenthal? Coons? Okay, so I'll tell you how we're going to do this. I'll recognize you in the order that I've mentioned here, going back and forth, Democrat to Republican. If there's anyone who wants to offer an amendment, I think I'm going to reserve that. You can state that, obviously. I'll reserve that action until everyone has made an opening statement. We'll characterize these as opening statements. And if people will try to use an economy of time, then we can move to the amendments, which may take a little longer. The list starts, of course, with Senator Leahy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would suggest there are different ways of studying for these kind of things. I spent 31 days in the hospital, and I actually got a chance to read some of the material. That is not the most pleasant way to read it, and I wanted to make sure it didn't change my attitude. But my parents had first owned a small weekly newspaper in central Vermont, and then began a printing business, the Leahy Press, which is still there. So based on growing up in a small city of 8,500 people, Montpelier, and with the background of my family, I support the goals of this legislation. We need to do something to help our small ailing newspapers. They're on the front lines, especially in a state like mine, are keeping us informed, but I see the pressures on them as they slowly start to disappear. Now, the Vermont Press Association, the Vermont Association of Broadcasters strongly support the bill. I take their views seriously, and I'd ask consent to introduce their letters into the record.
Without objection.
And I also believe, though, that the bill needs some additional work. I'm concerned that it may interfere with the way, basically, way the internet works. I'm also concerned that it could inadvertently contort copyright laws in unpredictable ways. There are a few other concerns as well. I will support the bill moving out of committee. I would leave open the fact that there may be more additional changes on the floor before I could support the final passage. But the sponsors of this bill have been very open to suggestions. I applaud them for that. And I'll continue to work for them on it. I won't do it from a hospital bed. I'll do it from my office here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Leahy, and I believe that Senator Hawley is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be very brief. I want to start by saying, thanking Senator Klobuchar for her work on antitrust. It's always a privilege to work with her. I hope that we'll soon get to vote on the American Innovation and Choice Online Act on the Senate floor soon. I know that she's been working on that, and it's a privilege to be co-sponsor of that bill. And I thank the other members on both sides of the aisle who have had a chance to work with on antitrust issues in the last Congress and in this Congress. I'm going to vote against this bill because it's not an antitrust bill. I think it's in important respects a pro-trust bill. It creates an exemption to our antitrust laws. And I fully appreciate and understand the rationale behind it, and I appreciate Senator Klobuchar's remarks in that regard. But my own view is that I remain a great advocate of our antitrust laws. I think we ought to be expanding them rather than shrinking them. I think we ought to be enforcing them more stringently rather than carving out exceptions to them. And I think, I wish this were an anti-social media bill, frankly. I think that would be a great thing to do. So I appreciate the work that the sponsors have put into this. I appreciate their motivations. But I just, because it is an exemption to our antitrust laws, because I think it will weaken our antitrust laws, and as Senator Lee, I think, quite accurately said, it promotes a cartel, I just simply cannot support it. So again, I thank the folks who worked on it for their work, but I won't be supporting it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hawley. Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start by saying that I fully agree with the intent of the bill to ensure that we have more journalists covering more local and more regional news in communities around the country. Quality journalism in every community is an important public good that holds people in power accountable, improves the health of our democracy, and keeps our communities engaged and informed. That's healthy for us. Now, regional, local, and community-based journalism is hurting right now. And I'm deeply concerned about what this means for not just the people of my home state of California, but across the country. I understand and agree with the concerns about the lack of competition in the online advertising market, as several members of the committee have expressed, and the inability of small publishers to fairly negotiate with the large technology companies that serve as gatekeepers, in a way, to online information. So I thank Senator Klobuchar for driving attention to this important issue, and I thank her for accepting some of the changes that I requested involving public accountability, and reflected in the manager's amendment. But I continue to have three major questions when it comes to the bill. Will this bill actually result in more journalists covering more regional and local news? That's the intent. Does this bill achieve that? Second, how will this bill help or hurt our efforts to combat hate speech and disinformation online that have poisoned our discourse in recent years, as Senator Kennedy has lamented? And I agree. And also, what broader implications or unintended consequences will this bill have on the future of the open internet? And I'll give an example here in just a minute. But when it comes to the first question about labor and the entire premise of the bill, my bottom line again is we need to ensure that workers actually benefit, and not just the hedge funds and other wealthy owners that have bought up so many local newspapers and are stripping them bare. Yes, local newspapers across the country owned by hedge funds. I recognize that there's many good employers amongst California news outlets who will benefit from this bill. So we can't assume that every eligible news outlet covered under this bill is a bad employer. Each employer in California, across the country, has a unique, earned reputation for how much they invest or do not invest in their employees and in their communities. So I think we need to be very careful about potentially facilitating a massive wealth transfer to unscrupulous media owners. Mr. Chairman, this committee received just yesterday a letter from presidents of the News Guild CWA locals and leaders of the Guild bargaining units representing unionized journalists. In that letter, they said, and I'll quote, "We have no confidence that these massively consolidated publishers will use whatever revenues they collect from JCPA to invest in journalists rather than more mergers, stock buybacks, overpaid executives, and union-busting lawyers, because that's how these companies spend the revenues they already extract from our members' journalism." So, Mr. Chairman, I ask consent to enter this letter into the record, as well as a letter from the executive director of the local independent online news publishers echoing these concerns.
Without objection.
Thank you. So, colleagues, if the workers who deal with these conglomerates are skeptical that any money gained from this bill will actually go towards employees, then this committee should be skeptical too. And that's why I filed amendments to address this. We're not at the amendments point yet, but I'll take them up at the appropriate time. Secondly, I'm deeply concerned that the bill will be used and abused by bad actors to disincentivize platform efforts to moderate harmful content such as hate speech or misinformation and disinformation. And I filed a number of amendments to mitigate these concerns as well. As written, the bill creates an ample opportunity to not only compel a covered platform to host their content, but also forces them to pay for it. And if that isn't bad enough, the bad faith digital journalism providers will be able to threaten to sue platforms for taking steps to enforce their community standards. I encourage everyone to take a good close look at Section 6A2. Under this section, if Gateway Pundit or Newsmax joins a joint negotiation entity and a covered platform wants to limit the visibility of some of their posts or flag them for containing false information about how and where to vote, just one random example, the platform risks new legal exposure under the bill as currently written. Any purveyor of hate speech or election disinformation eligible under the bill won't actually need to win in court to be successful. Simply the threat of a lawsuit would serve as a disincentive for platforms to act to address disinformation. The new legal exposure created by the bill will chill efforts to address the spread of misinformation and disinformation at a time when we should be urging platforms to do more, not less, just as many of us have been calling for. And I'm not alone in my concerns. A coalition of nonprofit organizations and associations sent this committee a letter warning that this bill, and again, I'll quote from the letters, forces platforms to negotiate for payment and to carry the content of any digital journalism provider that qualifies to be a part of a joint negotiation regardless of how extreme their content. This is a direct assault on a bedrock principle of content moderation on the internet and will increase the amount of networked information, hate speech, and harassment found there. Another letter by Tech Freedom and signed by 15 academics says, once again, I'll quote, absent amendment, the bill will be weaponized against moderation of hate speech, misinformation, and various other forms of online content that are corroding our democracy. And yet another letter warns, the bill may help sites like InfoWars and One American News Network demand access and even payment from the covered internet platforms, even if they carry or promote hate speech or disinformation. On the letters I just referenced, Mr. Chairman, I ask consent to have them entered into the record.
Without objection.
Okay. Colleagues, these are serious issues. And having administered elections prior to joining the Senate, I've seen up close how important it is to get the issues right when it comes to protecting our democracy. And lastly, I take very seriously the concerns that have been raised about what this bill would mean for foundational elements of the internet, including linking and public access to information. We've built the most open and accessible communications infrastructure the world has ever seen. We need to be thoughtful about policies that impose limitations on how sites can link to one another and how consumers can access news or information. So again, I fully support the fundamental goal of ensuring we have more journalists covering regional and local news. And I'd like to see the bill sponsors consider modifying the text before it comes to the floor to more primarily focus on those types of outlets, because that is where support is most needed. So I commend them again for their work, and I hope that Senators Klobuchar and Kennedy will work with me to address the concerns I've laid out here today before the bill comes to the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Durbin.
Senator Klobuchar.
I want to thank my colleague, Senator Padilla, for engaging with me and my staff on this bill over a period of months. We met again just this morning, and I understand his concerns. We are committed to working with him moving forward. And I know you have an amendment on, an important amendment instructing the Government Accountability Office to look at the impacts if this is to pass. And I support the amendment, as does Senator Kennedy, and urge the committee to support it. I just want everyone to know here I share a deep commitment to journalists. As I noted, my dad was a journalist. That's what motivates me to work on the bill. And just for our colleagues, I note again the Authors Guild, which is a national nonprofit association of more than 12,000 professional writers, including over 3,000 journalists, is supporting this bill. And I also think it's important to look at Australia. They lost more than 15% of their newspapers, similar to our situation, and they created a joint negotiation system, just like the one we're discussing today. In response, Google threatened to pull out of Australia entirely, and Facebook actually did go dark briefly until there was an international outcry that they were trying to do this in an industrialized nation. But when Australia's law went into effect, Google and Facebook continued operating in Australia and started cutting deals with news organizations. It's working. As I noted, they didn't go under. The internet didn't break. News organizations are getting a better share of ad revenue. There have been no effects on copyright law, no link taxes of any kind. That's not what this is. And no increase in hate speech. They've added, I think, one newspaper alone, 50 new journalism jobs, and students are getting hired out of journalism school. So it's not been long in the making, but it is one example of another country, which a close ally of the U.S., where they've seen progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Senator Blackburn, and then Senator Blumenthal, and then Senator Cornyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the sponsors of the bill for the work that they have done. And I think we all have concerns about what is happening with big tech, and we know that big tech is changing the way the news industry operates. And we all have heard from our small media outlets about how they're creating the content, but it is big tech that is making the money off of that content. Now, I have worked for years on making certain that our songwriters, our performing artists, are all compensated for the content that they create. That should be a goal that each of us share, to make certain that they do benefit from those works that they create. I do not see how this bill is going to help us achieve that goal. Senator Lee laid out some of the ways that that is going to take place. When you look at what would happen with local news decisions and those local newscasters facing the impact of what happens with these large corporate media entities or cartels and the power that they're going to have on the decisions that local news will make. It causes concerns for me. Likewise, I have concerns over the ability for dissenting views and viewpoints to be heard in the social media space, and they are having access to the ability to express a dissenting view. I think we do have to look at this and say who's going to end up benefiting at the end of the day. And at the end of the day, it will be the large media cartels. It will be the large media organizations, and it is not going to be the cause of free speech. I agree. We need to rein in big tech. Senator Blumenthal and I have worked on this for quite a period of time. Many others and I have worked on ways to rein in big tech, but I do not see this as a way to rein them in. I see it as an expansion of their reach over local media. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. Senators Blumenthal, Cornyn, Coons, and Cruz, and then we may proceed to the amendment process. Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. As Senator Blackburn has noted, I've been fortunate and pleased to work with her on measures that specifically target excesses or abuses involving big tech. And I think this measure is another carefully targeted and calibrated measure to make sure that we preserve both competition and journalism. And I think we need to be very clear-eyed, as Senator Klobuchar and Kennedy have been, in framing this measure, and I want to thank them for devoting the time and thought that has gone into this kind of exceptional measure. It creates an exception to the general principle of competition in the interest of making sure that we continue to have local journalism. And I would just point out, since we're in the baseball season, that there is an exception for Major League Baseball that bargains together in broadcasting negotiations. We have created these exceptions where we choose to do so, and I would argue that this exception to the rules of competition is even more justified in an area where we are depending on the flow of information, accurate and fair information to people who make decisions vital to our democracy. Now, we need to be cognizant that government has played a role here. Section 230 of the Communication and Decency Act has given big tech immunity from liability that local journalists have and local newspapers. There are other ways that government itself has contributed to the imbalance, the inequities, and the inequalities of power here. But we need to make sure that local newspapers, broadcasters have the bargaining power to make sure that their content is compensated for. And one final point, I was trying to think of analogies here. It's a little bit like one party freeloading off the product and work of another. That's what's happening with big tech. They're getting something they didn't pay for. They are profiting from a product that they didn't invest in producing. It's a little bit like plagiarism. I guess that's an analogy. Or a railroad selling the product that's put on its freight cars without compensating the companies that put it there. But whatever the analogy, what is sought here is basically to make available to local journalism the resources that it needs to produce the product now taken without any compensation by big tech. It is the source of a lot of money going to big tech. I share the concern that it should go back into journalism and reporters and building newsrooms, but I would trust journalists to use it in that way. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Cornyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just as a preliminary matter, I want to agree with Senator Kennedy about the importance of this bill and the importance of having the full committee to be able to participate. I'm not accusing the chairman of a conspiracy or the chair of the subcommittee, but this has come up before. The subject matter of this bill, I think, is so profound and so important that it deserves all the attention and all the input and all the debate that we can give it, because I think coming up with the right solution is very important. And the practical problem with the solution that the chairman mentioned, that letting the subcommittees have those hearings and then invite non-members of the subcommittee to join those hearings, is the fact that I'm on 3 standing committees, others are on more than that, and it's hard enough to navigate the Senate schedule to be able to do our job as it is without proliferating the number of hearings by delegating those to subcommittees. Again, I think what the chairman has said makes a lot of sense, but the unintended consequence of that is that many of us can't participate in the subcommittee hearing because of conflicts, and then we come to something as important as this, and really, I think what's most important is not what's convenient for me or anybody else, but the quality of the product that we're able to produce. So just something to think about. The reason why I think this subject matter is so important is because I think the biggest problem that confronts our country today when it comes to learning about what government is doing is confirmation bias. It's just too easy for us to watch our preferred cable news shows and to consult their various social media outlets or email distribution lists in a way that reinforces our biases. And what we really need, I think, in order to make better decisions and to make our democracy work better is to challenge each other with things that maybe we hadn't thought about, or maybe somebody's got a better solution to a problem that we've all identified. But just people huddled behind their computers or in front of their TV screens and just sort of like a Pavlovian response, just keep watching things and listening to things and interacting with people who believe exactly as we do, I think is one of the contributing factors to the polarization, or what some people have called tribalization of our country. And I think that's bad. So I think, you know, using some of the tools that we have here to protect competition is, as I understand it, the intent of the bill. We've done this before using copyright laws in the Music Modernization Act to make sure that songwriters were appropriately compensated, or at least had a chance to get compensated for terrestrial radio use of their intellectual property, as opposed to the streaming services that apparently have always been able to negotiate those royalties. So we used copyright law, and we've used patent law in the past. Here, the recommended tool is antitrust law, and I'm not sure what the best solution is. But I do think there's a problem, because small newspapers and radio stations simply can't handle the economics of losing the advertising, but also what we end up losing in the process when they go dark is we lose their point of view, their intellectual property, their investigations, the things that I think will add to our ability to be better informed and to do a better job of governing ourselves in our democracy. Too often today, and I guess a lot of that is because of where we work here in Washington, D.C., too much of our journalism, so-called journalism, is pack mentality and rumor mongering. It's not original investigations. Too much of our journalism today is just pure repetition of speculation. You see that all the time in everything from the New York Times, the so-called, Gray Lady, to other newspapers that I could name too. So I think trying to provide greater competition in the information gathering and delivery space is really important. Now, there has been some innovation in social media, for example, things like Substack apps, which have lowered the barrier to entry and to publish news subscription email lists and things like that, which has been very, very good, I think. But big tech clearly has been vacuuming up the work product of smaller journalists and broadcasters in a way that I think is fundamentally unfair and destructive to our democracy. It used to be that if you had a local paper and a local radio station, or maybe two that competed for your attention and for your ad dollars, that used to be pretty much the model. But now a lot of people get their news, as you noted, Mr. Chairman, from social media. And as Senator Kennedy alluded, I don't have any confidence that some of the big social media platforms don't censor their content for ideological or even political purposes, and that worries me a lot as well. So I think what Senator Kennedy and Senator Klobuchar have done is identified a huge and important problem, but I agree with Senator Padilla and others that the bill needs some more work, and there's a lot of unanswered questions that I have. For example, I'd be interested in whether an antitrust exemption is really the best tool we could use. In the Music Modernization Act, we use copyright law, and I realize that may not be directly appropriate here, but carve-outs for antitrust enforcement can and will have unintended consequences, I'm sure. And I don't know to what extent that then may proliferate into other areas. And I'm also curious about how some of this process would work. For example, I'm aware that a lot of smaller newspapers are owned essentially by syndicates that own hundreds of small newspapers. I'm not sure that we ought to be incentivizing them to be part of this cartel, as it's been described. Their incentives are wholly different from local independent publishers. I think we can answer these questions, and when we do, I look forward to supporting the legislation. But right now, there are just too many unanswered questions, and I think all of these are really important, but this is part of the legislative process of trying to do the best job we possibly can do and to hit the mark without unintended consequences. So I look forward to continuing to work with our colleagues, but I will not be supporting the bill at this time, and I will be voting for a number of the amendments. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cornyn. We have two remaining speakers in opening statements, Senators Coons and Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will endeavor to be brief. I want to thank and commend Senators Kennedy and Klobuchar and the other co-sponsors for their work on this. Senator Klobuchar, as the chair of the Antitrust Subcommittee, has single-handedly made it the most active and I would argue most effective subcommittee of this whole committee, and I greatly respect her detailed work. Having written a significant tome on antitrust law, having worked to find ways that we can modify and modernize antitrust, and I recognize our largest digital platforms exercise huge market power. And I think it's an open question whether Congress will take the steps that we must take to protect consumers and promote competition. This particular bill, the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, is aimed at mitigating the demonstrably negative impacts of platform dominance on news media and journalism. And Senator Klobuchar, is the daughter of a celebrated, recognized journalist, I think was just the right person to help shape this. I have admiration for the work of journalists and journalism as a local elected official, as a county official. Our crusading local journalists were the ones who held my predecessor as county executive accountable through a federal criminal investigation. And I was sharing with my staff this morning how my own early career in public service was shaped by folks like Celia Cohen at the News Journal, Alan Ludell at WILM, Jesse Chatterton at the County News. And all of us who are elected know that our constituents and our country are better served when there is a robust media at all levels. And I've heard from Delaware Public Media, News Journal, Cape Gazette, my own remaining local media in Delaware in recent weeks in support of this bill, and they are struggling to survive. They are struggling to survive in a digital environment. So, look, moving forward, I intend to support this legislation today. I think it's important that we strike the right balance between empowering news creators in this digital environment to negotiate for fair compensation from the platforms that use their content while not undermining core principles of free speech and the free and open exchange of information. There are a number of amendments that I weighed and considered. There's, I think, 24 amendments. I appreciate Senator Padilla's proposal, for example, to make it clear through an affirmative defense that this bill isn't aiming to prevent platforms from fairly enforcing their own terms of service. I have some questions about exactly how you'd craft that and prevent platforms from modifying their terms of service in unreasonable ways. I appreciated Senator Lee's proposal to allow some consideration of the value that platforms do confer to news organizations. But, you know, frankly, I want us to move this bill forward today, and I'm encouraging Senator Klobuchar and her co-sponsor, Senator Kennedy, to continue to negotiate in good faith with those who have offered refinements and amendments so that we can see this to enactment through the floor. And so that I could ultimately support its final passage. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Coons. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank both Senator Klobuchar and Senator Kennedy for their good faith work on this important topic. I find myself genuinely conflicted on this bill. I think it is endeavoring to solve a real problem. I think local journalism faces enormous pressures and threats, and I think big tech behaves like an angry giant squashing the Lilliputians before it. I also think when it comes to media, local journalism is far more likely to actually practice journalism, to report on facts, to actually describe to viewers or readers what has happened. I think much of our national media has become wildly politicized on both sides, and many of the national media platforms operate as partisan propaganda outlets. I'd like to see local media expand and proliferate because I think our democracy does better when we have genuine debate from both sides, or even more sides than that. At the same time, I do think the concerns that have been raised by Senator Lee and others are real. And I am not at all convinced that this bill will solve the problem it is intending to solve. And I have at least some concern that the bill may exacerbate the problems that it is ostensibly created to solve. When I look at big tech and when I look at media, I think the single greatest threat we have to free speech is not even the market power of big tech, but it is the wanton abuse of power and the blatant censorship from big tech. Several senators today have said, well, there have been allegations of censorship. Let's be clear, these are not mere allegations. It is unequivocal that big tech is actively censoring speech it disagrees with, and is doing so in a wildly partisan manner. We can point to a couple of very specific examples that are recent and in the news. The Biden White House explicitly asked Twitter, will you please ban Alex Berenson, a former reporter for the New York Times. Now, it used to be that Democrats thought the New York Times was a reputable organization. I have some real questions about that, but the fact that Berenson was a New York Times reporter ought to at least have some modicum of credibility that he's a journalist. But in the midst of COVID, Berenson dared question the orthodoxy that was demanded from this administration. The Biden administration demanded of big tech, silence this voice because we must have no dissent. And what did Twitter do? Happily complied and said he is banned. Now, mind you, Berenson turned around, sued Twitter, and won. They settled the lawsuit, they reinstated him, and Twitter publicly admitted that what he was saying was not misinformation. Anyone who cares about free speech ought to be troubled with this White House or any others directing big tech, silence journalists who are saying something I don't like. It's not just the Biden White House. We also have had recent revelations that right before the 2020 election, the Federal Bureau of Investigation asked Facebook, take down any stories about the Hunter Biden laptop. Now, look, pause for a second. I get there are partisan differences between both sides. And in an election, Republicans like things that help Republicans, Democrats like things that help Democrats. That's the nature of politics. Anyone remotely concerned about free speech or civil liberties ought to be concerned about the FBI asking big tech weeks before an election to take down information because it's politically harmful to the party they want to prevail. And by the way, it's worth underscoring, we now know the Hunter Biden laptop story was true. Not only was it not misinformation, not only was it not Russian misinformation, which is what the FBI falsely claimed, it was true, it was accurate, it was real. Nonetheless, both Facebook and Twitter said take it down, and they demanded of the New York Post, they deplatformed a newspaper founded by Alexander Hamilton with the 5th largest circulation in the country. They deplatformed the New York Post as long as they kept it up. Now, if you care about journalism, big tech operating at the behest of the FBI to interfere in an election ought to scare the hell out of you. So, when I look at this question, what is preeminent to me is whether this bill is going to increase or decrease censorship. I've got a series of amendments which I intend to offer this morning. And whether I vote yes or no on this bill is going to depend on what happens on those amendments. And I will say this to the authors of the bill. For most of us here, this is not our first rodeo. We've been through a markup. I understand often the authors of a bill circle the wagons and say, okay, any amendment that does anything significant, we're against. We got our bill, we want to force it through. And it's not that hard to count noses in this markup. I think right now, if this bill comes to a vote, you get most or all of the Democrats. Maybe one or two exceptions, but you're going to get almost every Democrat. And you'll get at least a handful of Republicans. That'll be enough to pass it. That will get over the majority threshold. So that if the objective today is to move this bill out of committee, you probably got the votes. That being said, I think whether or not the authors of this bill take the amendments I've authored, whether or not the authors of this bill are willing to do something meaningful to prevent partisan censorship and silencing of free speech online and in the media, I think will determine whether this bill has any realistic prospect of passing on the floor. Because a narrow vote out of committee, I think, is extraordinarily unlikely to actually pass into law on the floor. So I hope we can actually agree that free speech matters and come together on it. And I suppose when we move to the amendments, we'll see if we can.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. As co-sponsor, I'm going to call on Senator Kennedy to offer the First Amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to introduce Amendment SIL 22A64. This amendment protects both social media and our broadcasters and newspapers against frivolous litigation by requiring the losing party to pay attorney's fees under Section 3.
Is there any discussion of this amendment? Anyone wish to be recognized? Well, then I'll
Chair Durbin, I just want to make clear I support this amendment. It's something we actually have worked with our colleagues about. It's a narrow amendment that makes a change to the limited circumstances when parties initiate their right to go to court if negotiations break down. So I'd like to thank Senator Kennedy and working with other members on this amendment.
I'd like Senator Feinstein.
Could somebody describe the limited circumstances? I do not know what they are.
I didn't hear the question, Mr. Chairman.
Senator, would you restate the question, please?
Yes. Could someone describe the limited circumstances? I don't know what they are.
Well, this amendment would simply say if one of the parties who has a cause of action under this legislation, if it passes, proceeds in bad faith, then the judge has the right to order the bad faith litigant to pay the other side's attorney's fees. And what is bad faith is generally determined by the judge on an ad hoc basis, case-by-case basis.
Senator Kennedy, I'd like to make a comment. This has also in some forms been characterized as loser pays.
Right.
And I have uniformly opposed that concept every step of the way in my service in the Senate. But I do believe that this is extraordinary because we are dealing with resources on both sides of the equation. It isn't the victim in a contingency lawsuit who has no resources and is risking everything if he loses and it's found out that he filed the lawsuit initially in bad faith, but rather two entities, one being big tech and the other being the providers who have some wherewithal and resources to compensate the prevailing party in that circumstance. So I'm going to make an exception and support this amendment, although it does run counter to where I've stood in the past.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the amendment offered by my friend Senator Kennedy. I am going to oppose this amendment. In the instance of lawyers' fees and losers' pay, they fairly systematically benefit the big guy and hurt the little guy. In this instance, we've identified the big guys and little guys. The big guys are the big tech behemoths, and the little guys are the local journalists that everyone here is giving speeches about how we want to help. I think telling local journalists, if you have any lawsuit under the bill, you can be stuck for the millions of dollars of lawyers' fees for Google. It's a good way to bankrupt a bunch of local newspapers or ensure they never bring litigation under the suit. And as I read it, at least looking at the amendment, I don't see anything about bad faith litigation. I see it just simply Section 7 is a cause of action for litigating on this. And so we can have a broader discussion about loser pay across all of litigation, and there are pros and cons to that. But the idea that we would give a special subsidy, a special boon to big tech, that big tech and only big tech gets loser pay. So if anyone tries to sue these giants, they're stuck for the lawyer fees. I think that is ill-advised.
I would agree with my good friend Senator Cruz if he were right, but he is not. It's a very rare circumstance, I know, but this door swings both ways, and I think the amendment's pretty clear that a litigant, whether it's social media or a broadcaster or a newspaper publisher, has to proceed in good faith. And that standard applies to both sides. And I think the senator, my friend Senator Cruz, is a very able litigator, and I think he understands that it's a level playing field. If you want to file a frivolous lawsuit, that's okay, but under this legislation, you're going to have to pay the other side's attorney's fees. And it doesn't just favor big tech. I would never do that. It favors the smaller entity as well.
Could I ask Senator Kennedy a brief question on that clarification?
Senator Cruz?
Senator Kennedy referenced good faith. My understanding of the bill is that good faith is the obligation for how the parties negotiate under the bill.
Right.
And if either party doesn't, then you can have a private right of action and bring a lawsuit. But the attorney's fees here are not predicated on a good faith lawsuit. In other words, this is not like a Rule 11 sanction for a frivolous lawsuit. This is, if either party alleges the other party didn't engage in good faith negotiation, you can sue. And it may not be a frivolous lawsuit, but let's say it was 51-49 and you're on the 49 and you lose, boom, you get stuck with all the attorney's fees. So it's not bad faith litigation. Am I understanding it correctly?
Well, I'd make 2 points. As usual, you make a good point, Senator. Number one, that's why God made judges, is to decide what's frivolous, what's in good faith, what's not. And as you and I both know, that is determined on a case-by-case basis. Number two, it's often said that stupidity is like pornography. It's hard to define, but you know it when you see it. In this case, I would substitute stupidity for good faith. And it's impossible to define good faith, as you know. That's why we have a judge to determine that. And they do it all the time, particularly with respect to Rule 11 sanctions.
Senator Blumenthal?
Just a brief comment, Mr. Chairman. God may have made judges, but we're making laws here. And I just want to point out, as to the laws involved here, that the manager's amendment very carefully defines the scope of the right of action. And with that in mind, the bringing of a baseless or frivolous lawsuit is, in effect, also defined by the right of action. So I think that the amendment here clarifies a point that is currently accepted under the law, as Senator Cruz has pointed out. Rule 11, other state sanctions provide for penalties to discourage or punish the filing of baseless cases. That's the law already. I have opposed consistently, and I'll continue to oppose, unnecessary limitations on access to justice, which are the result of the loser pays provisions that have been offered in the past. I think that an exception is warranted here. I'm going to support this amendment. The would-be plaintiffs in these cases are comfortable with the amendment, and so I will support the amendment as an exception to my general opposition to loser pays fees, as the chairman himself has articulated.
You're a fine American, Senator.
Anyone else seek recognition?
Just to associate
Senator Whitehouse.
myself with your chairman and Senator Blumenthal's remarks on this.
Anyone else seeking recognition? Senator Lee.
I'm a little torn on this one. Senator Cruz makes an excellent point. In this circumstance, though, given that the standards of the bill, the way in which the arbitration decisions are to be made, all of the cards are cut in favor of the publisher, and so in this circumstance, it might make sense to do that, and I'm inclined to support it, the amendment.
If no one else seeks recognition, the question is on the adoption of the amendment. Can we do this by voice vote, or do we wish recorded vote? All those in favor of the Kennedy Amendment 22A64, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Ayes do have it.
Mr. Chairman, I ask that it be recorded as a no on that vote.
Amendment is adopted with notation that Senator Cruz voted no.
My second amendment, Mr. Chairman, is SIL A65. The bill right now has a sunset provision requiring that the bill would become effective after 8 years. This would reduce that to 6 years.
Anyone wish to speak on this amendment?
I'm supportive of this amendment. Again, something we worked out. Appreciate willingness to work it out.
If there is no additional request to speak, the question is on the adoption of the amendment 22A65. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Any further amendments? Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to call up my amendment SIL 22A72. This amendment requires the Government Accountability Office to conduct a look-back study to see whether the bill has achieved its desired goal, which is to enhance local and regional journalism. If we're going to make this big change to ensure that more money is going to publishers, we should ensure that it actually works for journalism and doesn't just pad the profits or the bottom line of hedge funds. Specifically, the study would look at the impact the legislation has on the local news, the number of journalists employed, the broader impact this bill has on the open nature of the internet, as I referenced earlier, and on the ability of the public to share and access news and information. It's also the amendment that Senator Klobuchar referenced earlier in her comments in support. I trust that Senator Kennedy is in support as well.
Senator Padilla, would you be willing to take a question?
Yes, sir.
We just adopted a Kennedy Amendment, which, as I understand it, provides for a termination date of this bill in 6 years. Does your GAO amendment require a report to Congress 7 years after the bill is signed?
Or maybe we should adjust it to come a little earlier to be part of that. I assume at some point it's going to be a renewal extension debate, so it can inform that decision at the time.
So are you suggesting you're going to amend the amendment pending before us?
So let's amend it to 5 years.
Is there objection to the amendment on its face to 5
No,
years?
I'm supporting his amendment. It's
All right.
good idea.
Without objection, the amendment is amended, and the question is on the adoption of the amended amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Any further amendments to be offered to this bill?
Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry, Senator Padilla.
Yes, just I'd like to call up my amendment SIL 22A74. Now, this amendment gets to the heart of what the bill is purportedly about, ensuring we have more journalists covering more local and regional news. My amendment would ensure that 70% of the money that publishers receive under this bill has to go to actually employing journalists. I've been clear from the beginning that my biggest concern with creating an antitrust exemption for news outlets is ensuring that media workers will actually benefit. In any industry, we know there's good and bad actors. Large venture capital-backed firms like Gannett and Alden Global Capital have bought up local news outlets around the country and are scrapping many newsrooms for parts and are spending available cash not on adding to the newsroom, but on stock buybacks and to boost executive compensation. So why should we reward bad behavior? My amendment would guarantee that money received under this bill will go to the hardworking journalists and news employees who do the work of keeping the public informed. Now, I've discussed this amendment with Senator Klobuchar earlier. I know she committed to me and stated so publicly earlier that she's committed to addressing this concern. I appreciate her commitment on this dynamic of ensuring resources buttress the work of newsrooms, particularly at the regional and local level. And with that commitment, I'll withdraw this amendment.
The amendment is withdrawn. Are there any other amendments to the pending legislation?
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Lee.
I'd like to call my amendment number 22A50. Mr. Chairman, this is a simple amendment. It's a brief amendment. It would just change the definition of what qualifies as a qualifying publication to include all publications with a common owner when counting employees, meaning it would exclude the large national conglomerates. It doesn't make sense to have the 15-employee limitation in place and to have that limitation not apply to conglomerates.
Senator Klobuchar.
I'd like to make just brief remarks. I appreciate Senator Lee's interest and also the work we've done, as you noted before, on the Google ad bill. We know that some small news organizations are owned by larger companies. We know that some are just small independent papers. It doesn't make them actually less important. I think part of the reason you've seen purchases of these newspapers is because of the fact that there's such a drain on their ad revenue, and it's created sales and mergers and the like. Yet we still have the market imbalance, and we still have to allow these news organizations, regardless of if they're small on their own or if they're owned by someone else, to be able to fight back against the dominant platform's market power. By applying an employee cap across all newspapers owned by the same parent company, this amendment would not allow the underlying local newspapers to be part of the joint negotiation entity. I think it would weaken the negotiating power. I appreciate the sentiment, but I do urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment.
I guess I'd ask, then why exclude some newspapers but not others? You exclude those with more than 1,500 employees. As I understand it, it probably means New York Times, Washington Post may be excluded, but perhaps others wouldn't be. But if you're operating as a conglomerate with a common ownership the same way any other large publication would be, I'm not sure what difference it makes in terms of bargaining power, whether they operate with different sub-brands. It's still a common ownership. It's still a large corporation. The distinction doesn't make sense to me.
Well, obviously, I supported including those news organizations, Senator Lee. I saw someone sent me a note that you don't exclude LeBron James from the Players Union. So I actually would have liked to include them. This was a negotiation on the Republican side to be able to get at the point that some of these news organizations are able to better pick up the phone and negotiate with the platforms, whereas even some of the parent companies with small news organizations have not been able to do that. And so that was the negotiation. And again, I would have included all news organizations, but I think the most important thing is to allow news organizations to negotiate.
Does Gannett need our help? I mean, it's a large corporation. I thought the idea was to allocate this on the basis of who needs help.
All we are doing here, I'll let Senator Kennedy address this, all we are truly doing is allowing them a seat at the negotiating table that they don't have. We're not giving them money. We're not appropriating, otherwise Senator Leahy's committee would be involved. We're simply allowing news organizations to be able to negotiate with the biggest companies the world has ever known.
And Gannett is one of the biggest media companies the world knows.
I will have our staff check the revenues of Gannett compared to Google, and I think it'll be pretty stark, the difference.
Senator Cruz.
I strongly support Senator Lee's amendment here. I do think the arguments being put forth in support of this bill are helping the little guy, and the threshold that was put in place in this bill is 1,500 employees. Now, Senator Klobuchar just explained the reasoning for that is that a bigger newspaper, a bigger station, has the marketing leverage to be able to negotiate directly. Well, under that reasoning, if you have a conglomerate that doesn't have 1,500 employees, that has 3,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 or 25,000 or 50,000 employees, then by any measure, they have the leverage to be able to negotiate on their own behalf. And if this bill is about helping big companies with 50,000 employees, this becomes a bill about having big tech and big media sit down and get together. And it's no longer helping the little guy. We just put in lawyers' fees to help big tech. Now, if this amendment is rejected, we're saying any massive media conglomerate, this is a benefit to them too. I think that is directly contrary to the arguments being put forth for this bill.
Mr. Chair, I would just like to put into the record the letter from the Texas Press Association. We have a similar one with the support from Utah. It includes, I would imagine, that these are a lot of small newspapers, rather who they are owned by. There are hundreds of them, including the Abernathy Advocate, the Abilene Reporter News, Albany News, Aledo the Community News, Alice Echo News Journal, Alpine Avalanche, Alvin Sun, Amarillo Globe News. These are just the A's. Archer City, Archer County, Athens Daily Review. I'm going to stop with the A. Austin American Statesman. The point of this is these are hundreds of small newspapers, pages of small newspapers in just one state that are supporting this bipartisan bill that Senator Kennedy and I have. They know this is their only hope, to have someone answer their phone so they can leverage their power and be able to negotiate the rates. And
Surely
we have
Senator
one for
Klobuchar
every single state.
Surely
Mr.
Senator
Chairman.
Klobuchar is not suggesting that those Texas newspapers she just read would cease supporting the bill if it didn't also benefit the massive conglomerates. That is a bit of a non sequitur to say, well, gosh, the little guys like it. What Senator Lee is suggesting is then we'll focus the benefit actually on the little guys and not on the massive conglomerates.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Kennedy.
First, Mr. Chairman, just to make it clear, the loser pays provision applies to both sides.
Yes.
I just want to make that clear. Number two, I understand Senator Lee's point and Senator Cruz's point, and as usual, it's a good one. But they're equating number of employees in a company with financial strength. I think that's a false. That's a false distinction. I mean, if just go look at Facebook stock and then compare it to Gannett stock. I don't mean to denigrate anyone, but Gannett right now, you mentioned Gannett, so I'll respond to that. Gannett is just going through a layoff of even more reporters. I don't think the bargaining strength, I don't think any fair-minded person could equate the bargaining strength between Gannett and Google to be equal.
Just to, and this is my last comment on this, I said I'd get you the revenues. Gannett's $1.86 billion. Meta, AKA Facebook, $85.96 billion. Google, $69.69 billion.
Senator Lee.
The question is not one that turns on Gannett's size relative to Facebook or to Google. It turns on Gannett's size relative to the other small publications that this bill purports to want to protect. Now, Gannett is not a small corporation. Gannett just paid its CEO $7 million a year. Now, I don't begrudge Gannett of that. I'm sure that CEO is worth every penny. Nonetheless, there is a huge difference between the small-town publications that Senator Klobuchar just mentioned and the other intended small beneficiaries of this bill and a major multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. It makes no sense to me to exclude publications with more than 1,500 employees, but then provide a special carve-out for those that happen to operate as a conglomerate rather than as a single publication under one brand. I urge passage of this amendment.
Anyone else seeking recognition? Well, before we call the vote, I'll have to say, listen to this debate. I'm not sure at this point where I stand on it. Okay, I'll speak up a little louder. I think of my situation in my hometown of Springfield, Illinois. The Illinois broadcasters have told me that they want this measure. I think they're right. Television station in my hometown is owned by Sinclair. If you've noticed, Sinclair is growing in size rather dramatically. I don't know if they are ineligible to be part of this bill because they have, I'm sure, in all of their stations more than 1,500 employees, or if this is just a question about the Springfield television station. When it comes to Gannett and USA Today and others, I'm not clear as to how we are defining the entity that we are applying the 1,500 employee standard to. Could Senator Klobuchar or Senator Kennedy address that?
Why don't we if we could take a 5-minute break, I'll get you all the details on it, Senator Durbin. This was negotiated with Senator Kennedy. Originally, it covered all news outlets because, as I've said, the news side of this, they are not making $66 billion in revenue. It's such a one-sided thing, regardless of who's owning the news organizations, that we chose not to exclude them because we actually think that the news organizations levering their power are still a blip compared to these major companies that are controlling the future of journalists and the things. But if you want to take a break, I'll get back to you on exactly so we can tell you what it is, or give me 10 minutes and I'll put it on.
Your premise that you've just stated is the reason that I co-sponsored the bill and support it.
Okay.
Could Senator Kennedy explain the 1,500 employees in light of what I've just given as
Well,
an example?
Mr. Chairman, this is my non-legal interpretation. And the way the bill is drafted, it would not apply to the Washington Post, for example. It will not apply to the New York Times, for example. It will not apply to the Wall Street Journal, for example. It will apply to everybody else.
And in the broadcast industry, with Sinclair, and they're not the only ones, owning many stations.
Sinclair would be covered by this bill.
So the 1,500 employee standard does not apply to Sinclair Broadcasting?
That's correct. That's my understanding.
The national TV networks are also carved out, to make very clear. It doesn't apply to them either.
I've seen that.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments to be made before we ask for a vote? So the question is on the adoption of the amendment. Let me get the exact number. 22A50. And all those in favor of the amendment say aye. Aye. Opposed, no?
No.
The opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not adopted. Are there any other amendments to be offered? Senator Cruz.
Mr. Chairman, I call up my amendment, HEN 22775. As we have discussed previously in this hearing, censorship is becoming more and more blatant on the internet. Big tech is more and more naked in silencing the voices with which they disagree. This bill, if it's enacted, would create an exemption from the antitrust laws to allow big tech to sit down with an enormous conglomerate of media operations and negotiate free from the antitrust laws. This amendment is very simple. It says if you're negotiating, you ought to be negotiating on the ostensible harm that this bill is directed at, which is the inability to get revenues from your content. You should not be negotiated on content moderation and how you're going to censor substantive content. So this bill simply says the topic of discussion when the two sides get together can't be censorship. It should be ad revenues, which is what all of the discussion of this markup has focused on, that if they do engage in collusion of two cartels getting together and engaging in blanket censorship, that does not fall within the protection of this bill. And I would urge the adoption of this amendment.
Thank you. Senator Cruz's amendment would eliminate the exemption from the antitrust laws if anyone is involved in the joint negotiation, even discusses content moderation. The bill is not about content moderation. I said this in response to Senator Padilla this morning, coming from a different angle, say it to you today. In fact, the bill actually includes several provisions to ensure that the bill is content neutral. The bill requires payment for content that is already being accessed by the dominant platforms. It does not require or implicate display of content in any way. The bill does not require a platform to carry any content at all.
But Senator Klobuchar, if I could inquire and clarify, you're right, the bill does not require that the cartel sitting down negotiating censor. But without this amendment, the cartel would give an immunity from antitrust liability for the cartel sitting down agreeing to censor. And so whether or not that is your principal objective, it would be a subsidy for censorship from the United States Congress. And as I noted, you in all likelihood have the votes to move this out of committee, but I do not believe this will move on the floor if the answer is that this committee is fine with giving a blanket exception from legal liability for explicit censorship and silencing of voices that the big tech oligarchs disagree with.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask a question?
Senator Kennedy?
Ted, let me be sure I understand what your amendment does, because you have two that are very similar. What you're saying is that when you sit down and negotiate, you're just negotiating over price, over money.
Right.
If somebody from social media said, look, I can give you a better price if you would work with me more on changing your content.
Or it doesn't even have to be connected to price. If they sit down and say, let's all agree to come together and silence the following voices. Without this amendment, that there would be no antitrust liability for that collusion of a cartel. Otherwise, there would arguably be antitrust liability.
I don't have any problem with that.
Senator Kennedy, I'm sorry. This amendment essentially gives platforms a get-out-of-jail-free card by presenting an obvious opportunity for gamemanship in the negotiation.
But I don't understand why.
Since news outlets depend on the antitrust exemption, while the covered platforms do not, the platforms could then raise content moderation at the first opportunity in an attempt to avoid the joint negotiations. So.
Well, no one faces liability for the conduct of others, and what this amendment would do is it would say when the cartels sit down and negotiate, they'd say, we're not going to discuss censorship, we're going to discuss price. And, you know, under your theory, by the way, I have another amendment to eliminate Section 230 immunity for censorship, too, so we could solve the big tech problem on that side, too, if we wanted to. But there's no argument that the newspapers would suddenly be liable because Google walked in and screamed censorship. Like, you're only liable for your own conduct, and this simply says if your conduct extends to censorship, there's not an immunity from this bill for that activity.
As I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, I'm
listening. Okay about that?
Yes, Senator Kennedy.
As I appreciate it, Senator Cruz and Senator Klobuchar, what it's saying is that the only issue on the table in the negotiations and the arbitration is the amount, if any, that social media will pay for the content, creative content produced by the newspaper. That if somebody walks in here and into the negotiations and winks and says, I can give you a better price here, but I sure don't like your politics, they can't do that.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Senator Kennedy, we've worked on this for months, and we won't be able to support the Cruz amendment here. So I'm hoping we could talk about this in the future, but if this is in it, we can't support the bill.
Well, I guess first, this is a new experience. We actually have democracy in action, where we have a debate here. And I don't understand why. I mean, I just, to me, the issue is supposed to be about money and not about moderating content. I mean, this just makes it explicit what I thought was implicit in the bill. If I'm missing something, tell me.
Anyone else seek recognition at this point? If not, the question is on the adoption of the Cruz Amendment, HEN.
Chairman, I ask for a roll call vote.
The question is on the adoption of the Cruz Amendment, HEN 22775. A roll call has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy? No. Mrs. Feinstein? No. Mr. Whitehouse? No. Ms. Klobuchar?
No.
Mr. Coons?
No.
Mr. Blumenthal?
No.
Ms. Serrano? No. Mr. Booker? No. Mr. Padilla?
No, by proxy.
Mr. Ossoff?
Pass.
That's it.
Mr. Grassley? Aye, by proxy. Mr. Graham? Aye, by proxy. Mr. Cornyn? Aye, in person. Mr. Lee? Aye. We lost. Mr. Cruz? Aye. Mr. Sacks? Aye, by proxy. Mr. Hawley? Aye. Mr. Cotton? Aye.
I can't vote for it.
Mr. Tillis? Aye, by proxy. Mrs. Blackburn? Aye, by proxy. Chair Durbin?
No.
Chair Durbin? The
No.
ayes are 11, the nays are 10. There's one pass vote.
That's it.
Clerk reported 11, 10, one pass vote. The amendment is agreed to. Are there any further amendments?
Senator Durbin, I don't think we can support this bill anymore, so we're going to have to hold off on this bill.
So,
Because Senator Ossoff did not give a proxy vote, so.
I understand that. I'm trying to figure out what the appropriate motion is by the sponsor of the bill at this point.
Chair, I do have an amendment.
Senator from Arkansas,
I do have an amendment.
you have an amendment? If you don't mind, Senator, I'm going to let the sponsor of the bill decide whether we're going to proceed with.
Why doesn't Senator Cotton go forward with his amendment? I'll talk to our staffs, we'll talk, but this was a surprise. This is a long negotiated bill.
Thank you. Senator Cotton.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to call up my amendment SIL 22A48. This is related to Senator Lee's amendment, which was defeated. That would have established a definition for the 1,500 employer cap at the enterprise-wide as opposed to the entity-wide. Since that went down, I propose that we lower the cap to 150 employees to make sure that we are addressing the true little guy who we all have in our states. Our daily papers in Arkansas, from Mountain Home to Russellville to Jonesboro to El Dorado to Hot Springs, are a combination of papers owned by large conglomerates like Gannett and independently owned. We've established they're all going to be treated the same, but I think that we should lower the employee cap from 1,500 to 150 if that's the case, to ensure that we are truly covering the little guys in this case. So it's a fairly straightforward amendment. It addresses the same issue that Senator Lee did, but just in a slightly different way.
Is there any discussion on the Cotton Amendment 22A48?
I have a question.
Senator Kennedy.
Senator, you're reducing the 1,500 cap to 150. Would that cut out, would your amendment cut out National Review?
If they have more than 150 employees.
Okay.
Whether they're owned by a larger corporation that also has other media enterprises, like Gannett was one example earlier, Sinclair was another example, or whether they are independently owned.
As I read your amendment, just to name several media organizations that this would eliminate, it would eliminate the Washington Times, the National Review, Breitbart, and the Daily Caller. Is that correct?
I have not asked those organizations what their employee numbers are.
Is there any further discussion on the Cotton Amendment?
I would just add that Senator Cotton's amendment would significantly undermine the reach and effectiveness of this bill by reducing the employee cap.
Any further discussion? Voice vote. So the question is on the adoption of the amendment by Senator Cotton, 22A48. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The request for a roll call.
Senator Durbin, I think we're going to end up holding this bill over because Senator Ossoff isn't here to vote on the amendments, and the agreement that we had has been blown up.
So the request is from the sponsor to hold over the bill until a future meeting of the Senate Judiciary Committee.
That's correct, Senator Durbin.
Can I withdraw my amendment then?
You
And
may.
maybe we'll offer it another time if we have another markup.
Certainly will. Thank you, Senator Cotton,
Thank
for
you.
that. So that is the, did we have another bill before us here? Check. No? I don't believe there's any further business pending before the Senate Judiciary Committee, so the committee will stand adjourned.